Okay, so some of the things that I want to talk about today is layer management, and just go over that one more time. It's really important for you to manage the layers because as this gets more complicated, you add more people, you add more things, uh, you can start to have 50, 60 layers here. And so if you don't get into the habit of naming the layers and organizing them, then you can actually turn and it become actually slow you down and become a problem. So this little folder button down here is a helpful little tool for you. It creates a group, and get in the habit of naming these groups. So I'm going to make a folder called color adjustments. And those color adjustments, I'm going to put in all of the subsequent adjustments that we're going to put in. You'll notice that I have the backpack person here in working. I might also add a folder that what I call background, and drag those into it as well. And you can see that once I have these in here, you can collapse these down, and it starts to make much more sense of what you're doing and how it's being put together. The other thing you'll notice what I just did was you can nest these things. So I have an entourage, which might be where I put all of the different people and landscape and trees and everything. And I can put each one of those as a separate group and just keep that nice and organized. Okay? Any questions on how to create a group, why you would create a group, how to use it? It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Get in the habit of doing it. Kind of two habits that I think are good to get into is every half an hour or so, kind of after you've done a few steps, go in and make sure that the layers are named, that you organize it, and then click the save button at the same time. It's just one of these things where you can kind of keep the momentum going, and if you have a failure or something like that, then you have some backup files. Okay, so we have the organization. I want to talk to you a little bit about that. Make sure that as you put this together, then that you understand that layer order matters. So as you notice, when I put in the background here, I had this one dragged up above, and it wasn't working very well, right? Because we lost our building. So layer orders matter, and the same thing happens with layer orders in terms of the groups. So you can see I dragged it up there, and now the person is behind it. So it goes from top to bottom. So just pay attention to that, and sometimes you get some weird things. But just make sure that you have that down and understand that. Let's see. Okay, so now let's get into color adjustments. So we've created a render. We've added some grass. We've added some entourage. Now the next kind of thing that we want to do is really start to understand how you can adjust colors. So right now you'll see that the image is fairly bright. It's fairly neutral. It's not too bad, but this is where you can start to use the color adjustments to add mood and add kind of start to convey what you're trying to get cross. So why do we create renderings? So why do we do this? Why are we spending time creating images of the things that you design? Anyone? Showcase it, right? And for whom are we showcasing? Right. Okay, so we have an audience, right? And it's really important to understand that every image, every diagram, every plan, every piece of visual communication that you're putting together is being developed for a specific audience and for a purpose. So you should be purposeful in everything that you're doing. So each one of these renders, these 4 renders, you need to ask yourself, who is this for? Who am I creating it for? And what am I trying to communicate with each of these drawings? If you're very clear about what you're trying to communicate, then it's going to be much simpler for you to develop the image, and because you have a clear goal in mind and you know what you can test against, right? Is it conveying that or not? Sometimes when we can go in and I have to create an image. The prof is telling me I have to have a rendering. Well, what is the prof really trying to do? The prof is really trying to get you to communicate your design ideas. And so each one of these is a tool. So go in and say, I want to showcase the entrance, or I want to showcase the interface between the site and the building, or I want to showcase this planting area and this procession through this garden, or we want to showcase the ecotones between different habitats that might be created if you're in doing landscape architecture. So be purposeful, and then set that as a goal and say, this is what we're trying to accomplish. So with that, some of the things that we can do is we can create a mood. Right now, if we show it as a sunny kind of day, it conveys one thing, right? But if we were to start to choose a cloudier kind of image, dark grays, which seem to be kind of a thing nowadays, if you're looking at current renderings, you know, these moody sort of images. That's trying to convey something else, and you have to ask yourself, is that what you want to convey? Okay, some of those images look cool, but you know, if you're selling it to a client, they may or may not like it, and so understand that I'm all for that in a lot of cases, but be purposeful in what you're doing. Don't just do stuff to replicate and copy what's kind of the fad nowadays. Okay, so with that, how do we create these different types of moods? Well, a lot of these moods can be done by lighting and color. So let's go down, and we have our color adjustments here, and we're in here. And let's go down and make an adjustment layer. And let's first do a levels adjustment. Okay, so when you click on that levels adjustment, you'll notice that we have a histogram. This is called a histogram, which is showing the content of pixels in terms of luminosity. So this is kind of the grayscale. So it's showing that in terms of true blacks, we don't have a whole lot. In terms of true whites, we have a little bit, but a good majority is in this kind of darker mid-tones, which kind of makes sense, right? When we look at this area over here, which is darker kind of mid-tones, not quite black. So that makes a lot of sense. A little bit of white, and some bright whites in some of these areas. So that is what that histogram is telling you. What the levels allows you to do is to make adjustments in terms of what is black and what is white, and what are kind of the grayscale. So you can shift it. So if I take this mid-tone and I start to shift it over, it's saying that that middle gray, that 50% gray, is being shifted, and you can see how it's changing what that middle tone is. If I shift it over here, it gets much darker. Okay, same thing with the white. If I shift it over, I'm compressing that image, and that middle gray becomes the white, and you can start to see how that shifts. Likewise, if I shift the black and start to twist that, I can shift so that the black is now in that mid part of that middle gray, and it allows you to adjust some of these pieces. So that's one way to do it. You can also shift it down here, so you can tell it basically that take white and turn it to 50% gray, and that's what you're doing with these little knobs. Likewise, I can say, well, I don't want a full bunch of black, so I'm going to pop this down here into this middle gray. There are some photographers and some renderers, if you get into this, that they talk about never using pure white or pure black. So they might come in here and shift this so that whites become kind of a light gray, and it gives it a little bit different kind of dynamic range in terms of how it's perceived. Okay, and then what that allows you to do is that in subsequent adjustments and layers, you can add on to some of these whites, and it gives you a little bit more gives a different sort of feel, not as much contrast. Okay, so that's the layers adjustment, or levels adjustment. I'm going to turn that off. Another way that you can do similar types of things in terms of that is curves. So again, we see our histogram, and I'm going to move this over here so we can work on it. And we have the same kind of white and dark, so we can shift this thing, but you'll notice that when we're shifting it, it's shifting this thing back over so that it's like that earlier version where we were messing with the histogram. So the other thing you can do is start to grab these nodes and move them around. And typically, this allows you to fine-tune within that picture just areas that you want to bend and make a subtle transition. So it becomes, the other ones were logarithmic, right? It's a straight line and you were just changing the slope of that line, but it's still a straight line. Now this allows you to make more gradient kind of choices. So oftentimes, kind of starting on an image, you might grab this middle ground and start to tweak this a little bit by dragging this down so you have a little bit more contrast. And you might click on here and add a new node and be able to kind of tweak this up a little bit or down. But you can see if you get too radical, it can really start to change the image. So the trick with these curves adjustments are making subtle adjustments. And so what you're trying to do here, what I'm trying to do, is just pop up the contrast just a little bit. Just make it pop a little bit more by doing these little tweaks. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. And by doing these adjustment layers, you can come back in here and click on them and turn them on and turn them off. So we'll turn that one off. You can kind of see the difference, how it pops a little bit. Let's add another one. So exposure is another way that you can adjust it. This is more similar to what a photographer might use. So if we turn down the exposure, obviously it gets darker. Turn up, lighter gets lighter. It's an easy way. We've used this before. Offset is doing that same thing about moving where the white point is. It just has a pretty fine adjustment. And then gamma correction also allows it, but it's kind of like a combination of using that curve, so it becomes kind of asymmetrical. It's totally usable, and if that's the way that you like to adjust it, a lot of learning how to use these adjustment layers is just clicking on them, manipulating them, see what they do, and see what it does to your image. After a while, you'll get a feel for which ones you like to use, what seems kind of best. But you saw that basically all three of these do similar things, just do it in a slightly different way. Now the last one is this brightness contrast. This is kind of the simplest way in which you can manipulate. You basically have two sliders and turning up and down the brightness. You can see turning up and down the contrast. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Sometimes that's all you need. Okay, so I have all of those turned off, and I'm going to go back to my curves adjustment because I like that one the best. So the next thing you want to do once you have the kind of brightness and contrast developed to an extent that that you feel good about, the next sort of thing you want to look at is the color content. So right now I'm looking at the image, and with those adjustments on those layers, I've made these colors have popped up a little bit too much, and it might be a little bit more than I want. So I can come down here and let's say do a hue and saturation. So the first thing I can do, my first go-to is if I think the colors are too bright or they're not popping enough, is to go hue and saturation and adjust this saturation dial. So I can turn down the saturation and turns it into kind of a black and white, turn it up all the way and it becomes crazy. And so what you want to do is try to find, you know, some sort of area and way that you want to, you know, that it looks real to you or nice. So one, you know, if we had a kind of one of those gloomy sort of images, you know, with a dusky, overcast day, we might turn down this saturation down, you know, quite a bit. But I'm going to probably, you know, try to find something that looks kind of more realistic. So I'm going to probably go right there. Now, I could also apply this to the grass itself if I felt like just I wanted this applied to the grass. So what I'm going to do is just show you if I just wanted to apply it to the grass and not to the building itself. So I'm going to turn this off. I'm going to go down to my background, and I am going to add that hue and saturation here. Turn it down just kind of where I wanted it. And then I can right click on that and create clipping mask. And so now it's just going to be applied to the images directly below. So it's not changing my building, it's just changing that background. So those are two different ways that you can utilize adjustment layers effectively. Okay, so we've done that. The next thing is go back to our color adjustments, and we have a few others that we can look at in terms of the hue and saturation that can be effective. So let's go back to the hue and saturation, double click on that, turn it on so it's visible. Some other things that you can do with this is you can shift the color perspectives, so you can shift the hue of things. So if you want something warmer, you can shift it to to this side. If you want something cooler, you can start to shift. I think this isn't the best way to do it, but if you need some kind of subtle changes, you might be able to kind of tweak that. It's mostly when you're going to do something like this, you're trying, I think, to make something a little bit abnormal. So normally, if I'm wanting to adjust the warmth or the kind of character of the color, the cast of the color, I wouldn't use hue and saturation. But I might mess around with this lightness, darkness to kind of tweak things. Again, I don't think this is the best tool for that because the curves, I think, are a better tool. But this down here, there's a colorize. Now the colorize is actually kind of useful because you can create things like monochrome, sepia tone type of images that might be appealing if you're looking at doing something like this. So it's a way of kind of turning a black and white image but making it just a little, adding color cast to it. And this is where the hue and saturation level you can really modify and adjust for that. That can be useful. Okay, so that's hue and saturation. Let's open up some of these others now. The color balance is really where I think you have the most effectiveness of changing the cast. So as you open up the color balance, you'll see that you have tones. So each of these tones here will be shadows, midtones, or highlights, and you can affect the colors of those. So one of the things that's really handy, I find, is to go into the shadows, and I can push shadows into kind of a cooler, more purple, bluish realm. And then I can still go into the highlights, and I can push them by pushing them into the little bit more yellow and a little bit more red. I can start to push them into kind of warmer tones. And then the midtones, you can kind of get a feel for, is that working for you? Or you can push them further into these reds. So one thing about manipulating things like this is how you can change and add this so that it you might be taking this rendering and it's rendered in this direction, but maybe you want to create a snowscape. So this is one of these ways in which you can manipulate that and take it into a much cooler kind of realm, or like we were just doing, something a little bit more plausible in terms of a summer kind of warmer vibe to it. But the importance is to understand the difference that, the highlights and the midtones are going to give you kind of your color feel, and then oftentimes you can tweak shadows and things that are dark into a cooler, especially if they're outside where you have the reflection of the skylight. Skylight is kind of bluish in color in general, so having your shadows take on a blue or a purple cast is not necessarily a bad direction to kind of look for. Okay, so that is color balance. So that is where, if I'm really trying to tweak an image in terms of its color, you can see how big a difference that starts to create. So the next thing we want to look at, go up into our there are some things that you can do in terms of photo filters that are pre kind of configured. So this is the warming filter. These are all based off of photography and actual filters that they would put on. So I don't know, these orange filters, I kind of think of the kind of Florida sort of warming kind of pieces. You can also go into cyan, and it can start to take into that bluer tint. So one of these things you can look at is you might play around with one of these first and see if that does it for you, because it could get you all that you need, all that you want. Let's see, the other piece is I think all of those. The other one you might use is black and white. So when we figured out one way, right, using hue and saturation, just turning down saturation to make black and white. But in photography, they can use filters and also manipulations to get different effects. So different types of film also deal with colors differently. So sometimes you might have seen some black and white images that have like really dark skies and things like that. So one of the ways that that you can do that is using these different filters. So this is a high contrast red filter, and so you can see that it's dealing with the blues much differently than in before. So if we do the blue filter, the blue is making the blues lighter, and the reds and midtones become darker. So it's a way of kind of converting. And sometimes if you do the infrared, what the infrared does is usually makes greens and vegetation and that kind of really pop and makes the sky pretty dark. So that can also be an interesting way of dealing with this, and you can manipulate, and you can just see how changing and twisting, it allows you a lot of kind of color capabilities to make a black and white image go beyond just black and white. You can really start to tweak based on color. So if you're going to do black and white, I think it's always a good kind of opportunity to look at that and utilize that. Okay, and let's see. Is there anything else? Okay, I think that is the main kind of crux of being able to manipulate these pieces. And as you can see, you can add multiples of these and layer these on top of one another. My suggestion is that usually you don't need more than 2 or 3. You probably just get to what you want to get at and not have 1,000 of these things applied, because at a certain point it just becomes too complicated, the interactions that you start to develop. So I think a good color balance and a good curves gets you pretty much where you want to be. And then you can do a particular trick that that we showed with the entourage, but we can do it in a bigger way, is to kind of paint light and dark. So if we do go down here and make a layer, and we do a solid color, and we want 50% in the black. So this is going to give our gray, 50% gray. So that's one way to do it. And you can right click on it and rasterize that layer. And basically what it does is it makes that layer no longer a smart object. Then if we switch this to overlay, we have our original kind of image back. And now if we paint darker or lighter on here, it's going to automatically start to adjust. So I'm going to have this selected. And one way to paint darker or lighter is using these tools over here, which are dodge and burn. Now, I don't know why they're called dodging and burning. Well, I do know why. It's basically an old technique when they used negatives and they were doing black and white prints. They would either focus light on an area to make it lighter, or dodge it with a paddle to expose the negative onto the print differently. But I'm going to turn this up just a little bit more than I would normally go. Okay. So this is the dodge tool. So I can start to create highlights in here by painting in with this dodge tool. You could do these things to highlight areas, to bring out particular kind of spots that you might want to bring. This, I'm overdoing it right now just to show you. But you can also use the burn tool in that same way. I'm going to turn it up and just to show you, to darken things as well. So one great technique that you can do is, with this technique, you can kind of start to create vignetting around the side. You probably know that from your Instagram filters or whatever. Kind of darken the edges and develop that. But what you can do, instead of just this overlay of a vignette, you can use the darkness to guide people's eyes back to where you want it to be. So you can start to darken certain areas that provide a little bit higher contrast and get people's eyes to start to jump into this area. So this is my go-to technique to develop kind of light and dark areas and paint in interest and color. And you can do it pretty radically and pretty quickly. I overdid it. I used like 75% as my exposure on these things, but usually I'm working in the 10% range and gradually building up areas to develop that. So, all right, so that's pretty much today. I will immediately record this video, get it up on YouTube so that you have it available to utilize.